In this video, I have explained regarding music and MIDI standard. MIDI means the musical interface digital instrument. Musical instrument digital interface. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this video link with your friends, gain the knowledge and rule the world. Like the video, write the comments, share this video link with your friends, subscribe to the channel, gain the knowledge and rule the world. Music and the MIDI standard. First, what is meant by music? A music can be described in a symbolic way. A music can be described in a symbolic way. On a paper, we'll be having the full scores. You might have observed the music whenever it has been played, especially in the stage events. The singer will be singing a song, and in front of them they will be having a note. In that note, it will be having a symbolic pages or an symbolic instructions. Those symbolic instructions will be representing the notes, and those notes will specify what music has to be played, and according to that one, what song has to be played or what words has to be conveyed. A music can be described in a symbolic way. In a paper, it will be having a full scores. Computers and electronic musical instruments will be using a similar technique. That means a computer as well as electrical music instrument will also be using a symbolic technique, and most of them will be employing MIDI interface, MIDI standard of them, which has been developed in the 1980s. Most of the computers and electronic musical instruments will be using a symbolic technique, and which will be employing MIDI standard, and this MIDI standard has been developed in the year 1980s. MIDI is nothing but musical instrument digital interface. Musical instrument digital interface. It is a standard which has been developed in the early 1980s. What actually this MIDI will be? This MIDI, that is a musical instrument digital interface, is a standard which will be defining how to code all the elements of the musical scores, such as a sequence of notes, timing conditions, and the instrument to play each note. MIDI is a standard which defines how to code all the elements of a musical scores, such as the sequence of a notes, timing conditions, and the instrument to play with each note. MIDI will be representing a set of specifications which are used in the instrument development, so that the instruments which are being developed from different manufacturers can easily exchange the information. MIDI, as I told, it is a musical instrument digital interface. It is a standard which will be specifying, or it will be defining, how the code of all the elements of a musical scores should be, and these will be specifying in the standards. MIDI will be representing a set of specifications, and these specifications, that means how the musical instrument scores should be. Those definitions will be present. According to these definitions, an instrument developing company, that is a manufacturer of an instrument, a manufacturer of a musical instrument, will be using the MIDI specifications, and they will be developing the musical instrument, so that the music instrument which has been developed from different manufacturers will be having the similarity of the way how the music will be obtained, or how we get the music from those instrumental devices, so that they can exchange the musical information. The MIDI protocol is an entire music description language, and it will be in the form of a binary. An MIDI protocol is entirely a music description language, and it will be present in the form of a binary. Each word will be describing the action of a musical performance is assigned to a specific binary code. That means each of the thing which has to be done by a music instrument, by a musician, will be described, and those description will be assigned a specific binary code. That means for each of the actions which will be performed on the instrument will be having a specific binary code. An MIDI interface will be consisting of two different components, and those are a hardware, a data format. An MIDI, that is a musical instrument digital interface, will be consisting of two components, and those two components are hardware, data format. As I told, an MIDI interface will be consisting of two components. One is an hardware, another one is an data format. So first we shall see the first component, that is an hardware. The hardware is a component which is used to connect to the equipment. That means it is used for the purpose of connecting to the musical instrument. The MIDI hardware specifies the physical connection of musical instruments. The MIDI hardware, that is the musical instrument digital interface, will be specifying how the physical connection of a musical instrument has to be made, and it will be consisting of an port to an instrument. It means an MIDI hardware will be consisting of an port. Using that port we can connect to an instrument, and it will be specifying an MIDI cable which will be connecting the two instruments. It will be specifying an MIDI cable. It will be connecting the two instruments, and it will be processing the electrical signals code which is received over the cable. Hardware, it is one of the component in an MIDI interface. It is used to connect to the equipment. It is a hardware which specifies the physical connections of a musical instruments. It will be consisting of a port which is used to connect to an instrument, and it will be specifying a cable, and that cable is called as an MIDI cable, which will be processing, which processes the electrical signal codes, and it will be receiving over the cable. It will be received over the cable, and this hardware, whatever is there, this one will be connected with the instrument by using an cable. That means the MIDI is a cable which will be connecting to instruments. The second component, that is a data format. The data format will be encoding information to be processed by an MIDI hardware. Data format is another one component which will be encoding information to be processed by the MIDI hardware. The MIDI data format will not be including or will not be encoding the individual sampling value, such as in case of an audio data format. Instead, the MIDI data format will be using a specific data format for each instrument. MIDI will be using a specific data format for each of the instrument, which will be describing the things like the start as well as the end of the scores, the basic frequency, loudness, in addition to the instrument itself. MIDI will be using a specific data format for each of the instrument, which will be describing the things like the start as well as the end of the scores, the basic frequency of the instrument, the loudness of an instrument, as well as the instrument itself. That means the details regarding the instrument also will be present in a data format. As I told, the MIDI will be having a data, and that data format will be specifying for each of the instrument. And MIDI will be having a data format, and that data format will be specific for each of the instruments, which will be describing the start and end of an scores, the basic frequency, loudness, along with the details regarding the instrument itself. This MIDI data format, whatever is there, it will be in the form of a digital, and the data are grouped into an message, and that message is called as an MIDI messages. MIDI messages, musical instrument digital interface message. When a musician plays a key, that means whenever an instrument has been used by a musician for the purpose of playing, when they play a key, at that time the MIDI interface will be generating a message, and that message is called as an MIDI message, which will be defining the start of each of score and its intensity. When the musician plays a key of a musical instrument, the MIDI interface will be generating an MIDI message that will be defining the start of each score and its intensity. This message is transferred to the machines connected to the system. So whatever the message has been generated by an MIDI interface, it will be transmitted to the machines which has been connected to the system. As soon as the musician releases the key of an instrument, another signal will be generated, and that is nothing but another MIDI message is created and it is transmitted, and it might be consisting of the end of the score along with its intensity. The MIDI data format will be in the form of a digital, and it will be grouped into an MIDI messages. Whenever the musician plays the keys of an musical instrument, an MIDI interface will be generating an MIDI message, and that will be defining the start score of the instrument along with the intensity. This message will be transmitted to the machines which has been connected to the system by using the cable which has been connected with the hardware. And as soon as the musician releases the key, another signal will be generated. That means another MIDI message will be created, and it will also be transmitted along the cable to the machines which has been connected to the system. Next one is the MIDI devices, musical instrument digital interface devices. We say a device as an MIDI device if that particular instrument complies with both the components which has been defined by the MIDI standard. That means it should be consisting of two components, a hardware as well as a data format. If these two things have been present in a device, and that particular device is obeying according to the MIDI standard, then we call such a device as an MIDI device. And this MIDI device will be able to communicate with The another MIDI devices over and channels if they compile with both the components according to the standard of an MIDI. That means one MIDI device will be capable of communicating with another MIDI devices over and channels if and only if they compile with both the components defined by the standard of an MIDI. That means both the devices which wants to communicate, they must be obey the MIDI standard, and they should be consisting of both the components, and they can communicate with one another over an channel. The MIDI standard specifies 16 channels. The MIDI standard specifies 16 channels. MIDI device is mapped onto a channel. An MIDI standard will be specifying a 16 channels, and each of the device will be mapped onto one channel. Musical data transmitted over a channel are reproduced in the synthesizer at the receiver's end. The MIDI standard will be capable of identifying 128 instruments by means of numbers, including the noise effects such as the phone ringing or an aeroplane takeoff. The MIDI standard is capable of identifying the instruments. How many kinds of instruments? 128 instruments it can identify by means of a numbers. Even it can identify the noise effects such as the ringing of a phone or an aeroplane takeoff. For example, 0 specifies piano, a 12 will be specifying a marimba, a 40 specifies a violin, and 73 specifies a flute. These are numbers. According to these numbers, the MIDI standard will be identifying the instrument. 0 means piano, 12 means marimba, 40 means a violin, and 73 means a flute. Some instruments enable a user to play a single score, example in case of a flute, and in some other instruments it allows an user to play the concurrently a number of scores. In some of the instrument, a user will be able to play only a single score. That means it will allow an user to play only one score, example in case of a flute. Whereas in some other instruments, it allows concurrent playing of an scores, example the mouth organ, or simply it is called as an organ. The maximum number of scores that can be played concurrently is an important part of an synthesizers. The maximum number of scores that can be played concurrently is an important part of an synthesizer, and this number can vary between 3 and 16 scores per channel. An instrument can play only one single score, or it may play concurrently a number of scores, and this number varies between 3 and 16 scores per channel. A computer uses the MIDI interface to control instruments for the playout. Means a computer will be using the musical instrument digital interface to control the instruments for the playout. What an MIDI interface will be? The MIDI interface, as I told, it will be consisting of two components. One is a hardware, another one is a data format. Hardware is used for the purpose of connecting to the equipment, and it will be specifying the physical connections of an MIDI musical instruments, and it will be consisting of a port, and which will be specifying a cable, and that is used for the purpose of connecting two instruments, and it processes the electrical signals which can be received over the cables. And the second component is a data format which will be encoding the information to be processed into an MIDI message whenever a musician plays a key. The MIDI interface will be generating a message, and that message, as I told, it is called as an MIDI message, and it will be consisting of a start of the score and its intensity, and it will be translated to the machine which has been connected. And as soon as the musician releases the key, again it will be generating another one message, and that will also be transmitted over the cable to the system. So the computer will be using this MIDI interface to control the instruments for the playout, and that MIDI interface will be consisting of two components, a hardware, another one is a data format. The computer can use the same interface to receive, store and process encoded musical data. That means even the system, that is a computer system, can also use the same interface as that of the musical instrument digital interface for the purpose of receiving, storing and processing the encoded musical data. A typical synthesizer is similar to a regular piano keyboard, but it has an additional operating element. And typical synthesizer is similar to a regular piano, but it has an additional operating element. As I told, a typical synthesizer is similar to a regular piano keyboard, but it will be having an additional operating element. What actually the synthesizer means? The synthesizer is nothing but an instrument which is capable of generating an audio signals. A synthesizer is an instrument. It is an electronic musical instrument that is capable of generating an audio signals. The next one, the MIDI and SMPTE timing standards. The MIDI clock is used by a receiver to synchronize itself to the sender's clock. That is the musical interface digital. The musical instrument digital interface will be having a clock. And it will be using for the purpose of synthesizing itself with that of the message which has been sent according to the sender's clock. To allow the synchronization, 24 identifiers for each quarter note are transmitted. That means for every 1/4 of a note, 24 identifiers will be transmitted along with the MIDI message. Alternatively, even it will be using another one, a timing code, that is called as an SMPTE timing code. SMPTE means Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. SMPTE abbreviation is Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. It will be consisting of a timing code which can be sent to allow receiver and the sender synchronization. That means along with the MIDI clock, even it can also use SMPTE timing code for the purpose of having a synchronization between the receiver and the sender. The SMPTE will be defining a frame format by hours, minutes and seconds. As an example, 30 frames per second. And you might have heard about frames per second, especially when it will be displayed. When you go to a theater while watching a movie, it will be displaying frames per second at the starting of the movie. As we get the advertisements, in advertisements also first it will be displaying a certificate. In that certificate you might have observed, if you are not observed, from next onwards observe it, it will be having number of frames per second for every advertisement. Similarly, the movie will also be having a certificate. In that certificate also, that will be displayed on a screen. In that also it will be having frames per second. That means it will be showing how many number of frames will be used per second. So this is a video regarding music and MIDI standard, and in this one I have explained what is an music and what an MIDI represent, what is an MIDI interface and what it consists of, what are the MIDI devices, and how the timing standards have been present in MIDI and SMPTE. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this video link with your friends, gain the knowledge and rule the world.